I had like 30 jobs. I was like all over the place. And like I'd try a job and then like 2 months and I'd be like, oh man, I got bored of this place even faster than the last one.
Relatable.
This actually like explains all of these things that I've struggled with for so long. That might be the biggest issue with ADHD. Those are the things that are going to take you away from what you said are your real priorities.
Hello, and welcome to this live episode of the ADHD Skills Lab. I'm Sky, the creator of Unconventional and also the co-host of this podcast. And today I'm so happy to introduce everybody to ADHD Jesse, otherwise known as Jesse Anderson to many of you. So Jesse is a well-known creator in the space, posting his strategies and thoughts across social media and in a weekly newsletter of over 60,000 readers. And most recently, he's written a book called Extra Focus, the Quick Start Guide to Adult ADHD. I had a chance to read this book, although my toddler tried to eat it. And it's a really wonderful resource to dip into for practical strategies, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So good to have you on, Jesse.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, me too. I do also want to say that we've joined by our wonderful producer, Sarah, who you'll know from our research recaps. Sarah's manning the live chat, and so she'll be asking questions that come through from our audience as well. But yeah, let's jump in. Jesse, tell us what it was like to write a book about ADHD with ADHD, because that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it was definitely a bigger challenge than I expected when I started. Kind of how I got started in this space, like writing about ADHD. I was diagnosed about 8 years ago and then just like researched a lot to learn about my own brain. And so I was like reading all this stuff. And then my daughter got diagnosed. So that was like more reason to really learn about this stuff. And then, yeah, about 3 years ago, I joined this like writing challenge. It was like writing short little essays every day for like 30 days. And so that sort of is where I got started writing. And after I'd done that challenge, I was like, oh, this is like a lot, it was like 15,000 words or something that I wrote over this little short 30-minute period. And then I was like, hey, maybe I could write a book. And this would be like, the guide that I wish I had gotten when I got diagnosed. Because when I got diagnosed, they sent me on my way basically like, hey, you have this. Do you want medication? No. Okay, well, then we have nothing else for you.
Have a nice life. Now
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. So that's kind of how writing the book really got started. Just that little writing challenge that got me going, even though I didn't end up using most of those words. But that sort of made it feel like, oh, I could do this. And then it was like, oh, this is a lot more work than like writing a whole book isn't just writing a bunch of little essays and sort of stringing them together. It's like a lot more to make it cohesive as a whole and like be enjoyable to read page to page. Which knowing how like reading books can be like a challenge for a lot of people with ADHD, myself included, very much had to keep that in mind of like, how can I make this something that pulls people along throughout the book so that they want to continue kind of reading it.
Definitely. And I think you did a good job because, I read it in, I think, maybe 2 days. And I know a lot of people said the same thing. Just being able to go through it like that just kind of keeps you picking it up again in the middle of everything else.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know about you early on. So you mentioned like getting diagnosed and having your child have it as well. What was it that made you decide to say that you had ADHD, to like share that information with other people?
Yeah. So as far as like how I got diagnosed, that part of it, I always knew something was weird about my brain. I think most people with ADHD kind of like, I don't know, something's a little strange or different here. And you just sort of like try to make do the best you can. And there's all of the stuff that growing up with ADHD like entails. There was that sort of in the back of my head where it's like, my actions don't line up with my intentions and I don't really know why, or like I intend to do this thing, or I'm trying to do that thing. I'm wanting to be, trying to be a good kid, a good student, a good employee, all those things. And then like all these like ADHD symptoms that I didn't know about keep showing up and messing up all my intentions to be like quote unquote good. So I've always had like all these challenges, and in particular being late to things is something I've struggled with for a very long time. I mean, I say for very like the whole time, all the time I've been here, I've struggled with time and being late to things. And so about 8 years ago, when a friend of mine had actually been diagnosed, and then his wife and my wife were friends, and they started talking. My wife comes back to me and she's like, so you might want to look into this thing a little bit more. And at the time, I thought I knew what ADHD was. And I was like, oh, I don't have
Mhm.
that. There's no
Mhm.
way. But then
Yeah.
I got curious, as people with ADHD often do. And I started reading
Yep.
a little bit more and then opened up this whole world of like, this actually like explains all of these things that I've struggled
Yeah.
with for so long. It's the like ADHD having the PR problem of like everyone's heard of it, but no one really like everyone believes all these myths because that's what I heard. You know, it's like I wasn't that hyperactive kid running in circles in school. And so I was like, well,
Mhm.
that's not me. And plus I'm an
Mhm.
adult now and only kids have that. And all of those
Mhm.
sort of myths that I believed made me avoid it for a long time. But for me, like
Yeah.
when I did find out, so I read all this stuff and I was like, oh, I definitely, definitely have this. And then I tried to get my diagnosis, which was like really hard. All the people, all the like places that specialized in it were only seeing children. I talked to my doctor and he was just like not helpful at all. It's just like kind of the
Mm.
stereotypical ignorant doctor that unfortunately doesn't know anything about ADHD. And like I will say, great doctor otherwise, like he just didn't know anything about ADHD. So he was no help for this. But
Mhm.
eventually I was able to find one person that would see me. She was like, I don't really have any slots, but you sound pretty desperate. So yeah, let's chat. And so I was able to get my diagnosis at that point. And
Nice.
I was super excited about it. So I was telling everybody. It was just like this, mind blowing moment of like, I wanted
Mhm.
to tell everyone I knew about this new thing. And I think I was really lucky at the time that I was in a job where I didn't have to like, it didn't feel risky to tell people. I felt like
Yeah.
pretty
That's interesting.
secure where I was at.
What career were you in at the time?
Yeah, so for a long time, I've been sort of a front end designer, developer. So I work on like web apps
Ah.
and graphic design, sort of all that entailed. And
Mhm.
I'd been at this company for a few years already and felt pretty secure in there to just like, I didn't feel at risk of my job to sort of talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's actually, I mean, prior to this job, I had like 30 jobs. I was like all over the place. I'd try a job
Mhm.
and then like 2 months and I'd be like, oh man, I got bored of this place even faster than the last one. Or
Relatable.
like, yeah, or I'd have some little like interaction with my boss that didn't go well. And then I would just blow up, like because of the emotional dysregulation. I would take
Mhm.
things to the extreme, or like I'd have a bad day and be like, I'm just not going to go in anymore. I'm done with that job. Like those sort of
Mhm.
incidences would happen over and over. It was usually me walking out of a job because I got bored, because I had a blow up with the boss and I was like, well, I don't want to face them
Mhm.
again. That's embarrassing. So I'll just quit and never
Mhm.
talk to them ever again, because that felt a lot easier than sort of like owning up to facing the consequences of something that I didn't
Yeah.
really understand. Like I didn't know
Mhm.
why I was responding the way that I did. And so I was just like, avoid, avoid, avoid. But this job, I had found a place that it was a lot of new stuff where I was like learning new things all the time. And so it kept my interest for like several years. And I'm actually, despite doing kind of all this other stuff and writing the book, I'm still working at the job, which is like almost 10 years,
Oh, that's cool.
which is wild.
That's great. It's
Based on
always
all the other
great to
jobs.
meet
Yeah.
people who are doing like both because your advice is so much more practical.
Yeah, because I'm really having to like live dealing with the career job and management and all of that, and like having to motivate myself to do stuff that isn't my priority. It's someone else gives it to
Mhm.
me. Like that's not the most
Yeah.
fun thing in the world, but it's yeah, I'm definitely kind of in the trenches with figuring
Yeah,
this stuff
super
out.
relatable. So they know that you're, also ADHD Jesse and you have the newsletter and you wrote the book. What is that kind of relationship in? Because I think a lot of people listening to this will have done multiple things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's been a slow process. I didn't just like suddenly become quote unquote ADHD Jesse or whatever. I just sort
Oh,
of
it
like
doesn't happen overnight.
so like I kind of was doing that writing challenge I talked about, and that was when I first
Mhm.
started to gather a little, I think I had like 1,000 followers on Twitter at the time or something, and I wasn't really doing
Mhm.
anything anywhere else. Like that was
Mhm.
the place I was doing stuff. And then over time, it started to grow and it got kind of exponential growth, which has been amazing. And then it was like
Mhm.
slow trickles of like someone else at work would like stumble across, like, I saw one of your posts on Reddit. I didn't even know you were writing about this stuff, or like things like that would sort of
Mhm.
happen. So it's definitely joked about a little bit around the office. Like people know that, like, oh, yeah, Jesse's got all these followers or whatever. And so people kind of
Yeah.
like joke about it, but it doesn't really come up too much. I do talk sometimes because the company, they have their own social media team. So sometimes we'll talk about different things. The company's grown enough that I'm just sort of, off doing my own little thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, I'm really excited to get into your strategies in the book that you so wonderfully wrote for everybody. So, we talk a little about the different sections. So, what I wanted to do was, depending on time, we can talk through some of those sections, and I'm really curious to know kind of what you found, what practical strategies you're using, because I know so many people are going to want to know, and you do share so much in there. If you are in the audience, by the way, feel free to type your questions in as we go about these sections, and Sarah will read them out. So, yeah.
I'm seeing the little notification in the corner that I'm trying to ignore that there's chat because I know it'll totally throw me off. So I'm sure we'll be addressing some of those later.
So, I mean, I think I'll just give you like a little TLDR. So far, your experiences is resonating in various ways with the people who are listening. I mean, I think that's not surprising given the sections of the book and your whole thing. So we'll get there. But yeah, everybody is on board. Nice to have you.
Wonderful. Cool. Yeah. So let's go with the first bit. You talked about unraveling that ADHD mind. What was the most surprising thing that you found, like really deep diving into the ADHD mind and what it was?
There's even another section of the book that I ended up ultimately taking out where I kind of dove even more into sort of like the science behind like what's going on in our brain. And it was really fun to like research that stuff and just like there's all the like brain chemistry going on with the dopamine, obviously, and like serotonin. Oh, there's another one that I can't remember the name of, which I'm sad I can't remember the name of because I figured out the pronunciation, which is really difficult.
Norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine, that's the one.
Sarah would know. I was just thinking that.
Awesome.
Yeah, we love this stuff.
So I was doing like a lot of research understanding that, which was really cool, and just like how that impacts so much of the stuff in your brain, like obviously like executive function, but everything that's wrapped up in that with memory and like organizing and sleep, and like all these things that are like really important that like if you have ADHD, you know that like all these things are really affected by having ADHD. And these chemicals are a lot of reason why. I ultimately took it out of the book because I felt unqualified to talk about it to a point. I was like, I don't want to say, because some of it's still like being researched and people haven't landed on like, this is the answer. It's like, this is what people think as far as like dopamine transporters and they're like all this stuff that's really fun to read about, but it's like it felt a little bit like I don't want this to be outdated in like 2 years when there's a new discovery about it or something like that. And also it was kind of, while I was super fascinated by it, I know that not everybody reading, they're like, yeah, whatever's happening, I just want to know how to fix my memory or whatever the thing is. So I ultimately took it out, but that I think was the most interesting or like surprising thing when I was researching, just like learning about how all these kind of neurochemicals work and why it feels like our brain is like starved for dopamine, even though it's not like a lack of dopamine, and all the complicated sort of stuff going on there. I found really fascinating.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you are talking to the right people. We do a research recap every 2 weeks where we literally just nerd out about the stuff, for lack of a better word. So I was curious.
But it takes a lot
about
of time. It takes a lot of time to do that extensive research. So just like shout out. Great job. You did it.
Awesome.
That's awesome. And so the second part, of the book, you talked about motivation and how you motivated yourself with ADHD. I'm curious because you wrote a book, and that, I mean, I've never written a book, but I did a thesis. And so motivation is so tough when you're in those sort of like mid to late stages of a book.
Totally. Yeah. So I like briefly, I'll talk about in the book, I talk about the 4 C's of motivation, which is based very much directly on Dr. William Dodson's idea of the interest-based nervous system. But I call it the 4 C's because it's easier for me to remember, which is captivate, create, compete, complete. And basically it's about how do I make something like captivate my attention, or how do I make it creative or novel? That's the create part. And then compete, how do I make it like a challenge that's like kind of in that Goldilocks zone of like, difficult, but achievable. Like it sort of feels like I think I can do that. And if I do, it's going to feel really good. And then the final
Hmm.
complete being all about like due dates, urgency, that sort of thing. And so I kind of used a lot of those in finishing the book. So like when I started the
Hmm.
book, it was pretty easy at the beginning. Like I had all this excited energy. I like announced it. People were really encouraging. And I was like, woo, I'm writing. This is great. This feels amazing. I was writing all
Oh,
this stuff.
yeah.
And then I hit that lull in the middle where like 2 or 3 months went by and I was like, oh no, I haven't even touched a book in like months. This is not good. This is never going to get finished. It's
Hmm.
going to take 10 years. And so I really probably primarily leaned on like urgency. Like, how can I create urgency to help motivate me to write the book? And what it really came down to, like, I decided to go with the self-published route. And so because of that,
Yeah.
I didn't have a publisher that was like, knocking on the door saying, hey, we need the next draft. It was all on me.
Yeah.
And so I did hire an editor. And that's like one of the things I did, like hiring the editor. And he gave me deadlines, but not just like fake deadlines, like real ones. And so what I mean
Yeah.
by that is he would say, hey, I can review, like, we would talk and we would agree on a date. And he's like, cool, get it to me by this date. If you miss it, like, that's fine because you're paying me. We'll just do it later. But just so you know, I have other clients. And so if you miss this date, I won't be able to review your manuscript for like another 3 months or
Ah,
something like that. And that
that's
made it
great.
very real because then it was like, if I
Yeah.
miss that date, it's going to cost me 3 months for my release date because it'll just like be that lost time. And that was extremely motivating. So that really helped a lot. And then like the second
Yeah.
thing, quickly, I announced via my newsletter that I was going to have beta reading. And so I asked like, who wants to be a beta reader of like an early version of the book? I'm going to release the first beta version on this date. And people signed up. And then I was like, well, I can't show them what I have right now because right now it's a mess. It is not something I want anybody to see. It's that really crappy first draft of a book. And so that was super motivating. Again, I had that due date of like, I have to send the beta version to people.
Yeah.
I need to work on it and get it to a point where it isn't embarrassing. Because this is like, I'm basically in a way like leaning back on like, how did I survive school? Is like, I did all my papers the night before.
Hmm.
And that urgent,
Hmm.
and I did pretty good. Like, I think a lot of people with ADHD, I don't know if it's that we learn to thrive, but a lot of us do really well under that kind of urgent pressure.
Yeah.
And it's maybe not the very best work, but I can get a lot done and it's pretty darn good.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. I think, this idea that you're bringing in a lot of that urgency, but you're breaking it down. So, your urgency isn't, hey guys, the book's going to be out on December 25th or whatever at this particular date. And then you have to write the book the night before. It was those like smaller urgency deadlines, which is such a good idea.
Yeah, it really worked out the way. I don't know if I thought that far ahead. I was just like, I have to get more work done. But yeah,
Yeah.
the ultimate result, I was sort of chunking along the way, so I was getting like good progress on the book without doing something crazy like saying it's not going to be out next month and then somehow trying to figure that out. So it worked out
Yeah.
because it was like a good real deadline for me, but it wasn't one that had like external consequences that could have derailed the whole project. Because I've done that before. That you like announce it and then you're like, oh, it's not going to
Yeah.
happen. I guess I'm just going to kill the whole thing and hope no one asks me what happened to that thing
No one
I talked
notices.
about.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
have it in
So
that thing
look,
of like, surely no one will notice that I just killed an entire project publicly.
right. Yeah. So thankfully that didn't happen here. And I did get to that release date eventually.
Yeah, definitely.
We know that ADHD can feel overwhelming and frustrating, and that's on a good day. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate that alone.
That's why we created the ADHD Academy, where adults with ADHD can meet, join, share stories, and support each other in a judgment-free way. If you want to connect with others who truly understand you and learn research-based strategies to help you feel more in control and build momentum in your life and work, you found the right place.
Together, let's transform your ADHD challenges into strengths. If you'd like to know more, you can click the link below to join us in the ADHD Academy.
Hope to see you there. Before we jump into time, Sarah, is there any questions in the chat about Motivate?
Somebody in the chat asked about how do you continue to focus on one task that you're working on when there are other sort of important and urgent things nagging at you? Yeah, I mean, I know that can be such a tough experience. So
Yeah. So I mentioned before, like where I realized that like 2 months had gone by and I hadn't touched it. And that happened like a couple of times. And so I really had to evaluate my priorities. Cause right now the book is just sort of like, other than when I had those like urgent deadlines, outside of those, it was just sort of like this big, long, non urgent thing
Mm-hmm.
that was important. It would fall down to like sixth or seventh on my like priority list. And so because of that, I would only have time to work on the first like three or four things every day. And so I like never got down to the book. And so I had sort of at the beginning of 2023, I was doing tons of stuff and I was like, I'm not making any progress. What am I going to do? And I basically had to make a choice to kill like a few different things that I was working on. So at the time, I'd partnered with somebody on a like habit tracking app that we were building, which is going really well, but it was like eating up a ton of my time. And so I just decided like I really need to finish this book. And so I stepped away from that project. The other thing
Mm-hmm.
I did at that time, I was doing my own podcast, ADHD Nerds, which was doing really well and I was really enjoying it, but it was taking up a lot of that spare time that I had available. And so I put that on pause as well. Like, hopefully I'll bring it back later this year, but I basically announced like, this is the end of season 1 because I don't want to say I'm done with it. I would definitely want to come back, but it needs to go, be put that on the shelf so that I can make the book, move that up in that priority list. There's actually this really great exercise that I found helpful where you basically like take a piece of paper or whatever and write down like, what are your 20 top priorities? And so you write down like, what are the 20
With
things that
ADHD, I'm like, done, got them, 20 right there.
Right. Here's the exercise though. So you write down those 20 things and then look at them and circle the 5 most important, which is hard to do. You're like, okay, what are the actual 5 most important? And once you circled those 5, like, okay, those are the 5 things to prioritize. The other things on the list, the other 15 items, those are the things to avoid at all costs because those aren't just like secondary priorities. Those are the things that are going to take you away from what you said are your real priorities.
Okay, I'm going to do that right after this call.
Oh, it's such a great exercise because it really helps you. Like, these aren't the other things I should sort of be doing too. It's like, no, those are getting in the way. Those are ruining the things that you want to prioritize. So I find that to be a really helpful exercise. And sometimes I'm like, I'm going to cheat and add a 6th priority because I really need that one in there. But it really helps you see like, oh, this thing's just getting in the way. This is not helpful to what I say that I want to be doing. This thing right here is really just a distraction that keeps getting in the way. And oftentimes it's because it's a good idea and it's helpful. And maybe it even has something that's really easy to do. So you can find yourself sliding over to that priority, that thing, because it's like not the most important, but you can make a little bit of progress on it. And so you kind of like get pulled away to that often. So I find it something to really help you just to see like where you are. Cause I lose track of all the things that I'm doing. And like, I have no idea what my priorities are until I take the time to like actually write them down.
Yeah, that's so great. That's such a good point. Sarah, did you have another question on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, how do you narrow down those 5?
Oh, it's hard.
Do you have a formula? Is it like MX plus BX or?
Tell us the secret.
I sure wish. I wish like AI could solve that for me or something. Yeah,
maybe someday. But
yeah. We'll put it in Goblin Tools. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
Somebody else is asking about the Eisenhower matrix. Is that something that you've used personally, Jesse?
Yeah, so I don't strictly use that one. And for people that don't know, the Eisenhower matrix is the idea of you kind of take your different tasks and you're like, oh, this one, is this urgent or not urgent? And then you also look at it and say, is this one important or not important? And so you end up with this like 4 quadrants. So like you can really easily see like, oh, these are the tasks that are urgent and important. Those are probably what I should focus on. Whereas the ones that are down and they're like neither urgent nor important, like maybe I should just like remove those from my to-do list or whatever. So I find that like matrix where you kind of have the X axis, Y axis to get kind of those 4 squares. I find that to be super useful. Like sometimes the Eisenhower is a way to do it. Other times I'll just do like, because I know what motivates me, I'll do like what fun and not fun. And then maybe important and not important. So then I can see like what's important, but also fun. Oh, maybe I should do those first because it's going to be really easy to motivate myself to do that. But then I can see the ones that are important and not fun. And like, okay, those are the ones I should tackle when I'm in kind of, I've got that momentum going and I'm feeling like I can get a lot of stuff done today, maybe I can tackle a few of those. Like I've got that freight train of motivation that does not happen often, but when it does happen, I feel like I can get that stuff done. And I feel like you
Yeah.
can kind of plug in any two values there. And it just really helps you separate what often just looks like a giant list of like 40 things, and they all look the same and they all feel important. And so I like to play with what the X and Y axis are on those matrix. But the Eisenhower
I love
one,
that.
urgent, important, is definitely a great starting point.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. That's awesome. So I want to jump in and ask you about time. So the other one you mentioned, and I thought this was such a great phrase, which was the clockless mind, the
Mm.
ADHD experience we all have when we go, wait, you have time going on in here? What is this? So tell me
Totally.
about how you've sort of found strategies to support your time.
Yeah, time is such, I feel like that might be one of, if not like the biggest issue kind of with ADHD, at least for me personally, like time, it's just like not quantifiable to my brain. Like I don't really understand the difference between like 5 minutes and 50 minutes. And
Mm,
so I'll find like the thing that happens all the time for me. I'll have an appointment and I'll be like, oh, I've got to go to the dentist or whatever. And it takes like 15 minutes to drive there. And oh, look, I have to leave because, my appointment starts in 20 minutes. And then I'm like walking out the door and I glance over and I'm like, oh, that mail, actually, I could go sort that mail right now. I've got a few minutes for that. And then I just like pile on all these like extra little tasks that I definitely cannot fit in that time, especially because my 15-minute estimate is like imagining perfect traffic, find the perfect parking spot right away. Maybe I don't even think about the fact that I have to park. I just think like as soon as I get into the driving, into the driveway of the place, that I'm instantly in the appointment.
yeah.
Like I just like forget all these little things that sort of stack up that are important for time because I'm like doing all these like random tasks at home. Like I've tried to analyze like why does that happen? Why do I do these tasks that I normally don't think are important? Like that mail had been sitting there for months or whatever. Why now has it happened? And I think there's like actually something going on inside me of like I feel that energy of like time urgency, and I bet I can get these extra things done. And so I feel like there's
Mm,
like this
mm.
extra urge to tackle these tasks that normally I would totally avoid because I don't have any sort of urgency. It's almost like
Yeah.
something in my brain is like this isn't based on any studies or not. So I have no
No, but
idea.
I
But
read
this is
that in
like,
your book. Yeah. And I thought that was such a great idea. I think you might be right.
yeah, it
Yeah.
feels like my brain is like, ooh, we got to get these while we can. We've got whatever this
Yeah.
like magical property going on in the brain because that urgency. We try to tackle this thing, and then it like gives me all sorts of trouble because yeah, I end up late to like almost every job interview I've ever done. I've been late to, and I'm like, I was late to school probably every single day. Like at least 95% of the days in school, I was late to school because I just would like lose track of that time. I mean, I'll fully admit this is definitely one I continue to struggle with, particularly being on time. That's something that I definitely have not solved.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one thing that can help is like basically kind of journaling time. So, like when
Hmm.
I talk about that dentist appointment, taking the time to like write down my estimate, like how long do I think it takes to get to the dentist's office, and then actually tracking it, like setting a timer when I leave the house and then stopping it when I'm actually in the office. And I'm going to be really surprised. Maybe it's just like a task at home, like how long I think it's going to take to load the dishwasher or some sort of thing like that. Because when you do that, again, it's sort of like that matrix exercise of like giving yourself a way to see like reality, like putting it through
Yeah.
a new frame. Because I know that I'm bad at estimating time, but at the moment when I do estimate time, it's like I don't acknowledge in that moment how off my estimation is going to be. And so by taking the time to like journal it, it can give you like that little framework of like, oh, I thought it was going to be this. And it was actually like a third of that, or like 5% of how long I thought it was going to
Yeah.
take, and that sort of a thing.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. I mean, I know for myself, like being late to school was like the thing I got in trouble for more than anything. And I
Mhm.
was like you, I was like trying to please everyone, but I still couldn't quite get there on time. And I see,
Yeah.
Sarah, you had a question about something to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, we lose so much time in transition with ADHD because that's really when our inattention comes out to play.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that's sort of what's going on there. And I actually just wanted to pipe in because earlier, the thing that you were like, I'm not really sure if this is based in research, actually was sounding like an article we read about the automatic avoidant thoughts, these automatic thoughts that come up that prompt you to avoid something else that you're trying to do. And they tend to be overly optimistic as well as negative.
Yeah, we'll link the article in the podcast.
Awesome.
Sure,
Yeah,
great idea.
I'll definitely check that out as well, because that sounds right up my alley. Cool.
Yeah. It's often, the stuff you're like, I'm pretty sure this is real. And it's like, well, it is your brain. So you're probably onto something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
if you were to say, okay, time, being late, let's start with being late. What is the number one strategy that you would recommend for somebody who is struggling, like a starting point?
So this is the part where I am like, I know I wrote down really good strategies in my book, and now I'm like trying to remember, like, what did I say in my book?
Yeah, memory is the next chapter.
I know, exactly. Yeah. I'm like completely blanking right now. I know I have really great strategies in the book. Do you remember?
This meeting. So,
I was on time for this meeting. Well,
what were the strategies?
Well, for a meeting like this is the problem where you get stuck in waiting mode. That's a little bit what I had today, whereas like I knew that I couldn't be late for this, particularly because it was live, and so that I knew that there were
upping the dopamine
here
on purpose.
Yes, yeah, totally. I think it's an effective strategy, and there's a strategy right there. Because of that, I grabbed an early lunch, and then I kind of just like sat around and did nothing, because I'm like sitting in that waiting mode, because otherwise I know if I start to do something, then I might like remember this like 6 hours later, that sort of a thing.
It's so easy. I think sometimes with clients, what we've done before is we've set an alarm to start waiting. So it's like how much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like 2 hours before waiting mode starts. So it's like,
right.
You're still waiting. It's important to wait, but we'll just make it like from 6 hours to 2 hours.
Totally. Love that.
Awesome. Well, speaking of memory, that was the next bit that you chatted about, which was, when did you notice that you were struggling? You mentioned that it was a big factor for you, and I know it is for a lot of people.
I think the most interesting thing about memory is like before getting diagnosed with ADHD, I had no idea that I had a memory problem. It was like complete news to me. Because our brains are so good at just sort of like filling in all those gaps. And so I was just really confused, because I would have like all these things that happened where like my reality didn't match someone else's reality. And that would cause all sorts of conflicts and stuff like that. But it didn't occur to me that that's because my reality was made up in my head, and because I was filling in the gaps where my memory was sort of faltering. I didn't realize this until I'd mentioned I finally found someone that helped me kind of get diagnosed. And I'd been seeing her for, I don't know, like 4 or 5, 6 months or something. And at one of our appointments, I just kind of asked her, like, from your perspective, what do you think my like biggest struggle with ADHD is? And she was like, you forget a lot.
And you're
I was like, what? What are you talking about? Yeah. And then she just sort of like laid out, like, here's some things we talked about. And then this is when we talked about it later. And you had no recollection of our previous conversation. And so a lot of those just like memory gaps, like it just sort of like made me more aware of like, oh, that's a lot of conflicts I've had with people, is because I didn't realize my brain was filling in the gaps with this much more positive version of what actually happened. And so like, for example, like my marriage, there was a time before I got diagnosed where my wife would tell me pretty much every night, she would say like, hey, can you take out the trash tonight before you go to bed? And I would say, sure, yeah, no problem. And then she would like, go off to the bedroom, and then I'd get off the couch sometime later, and that completely gone. No idea of that thing. And that's, what's it called? Oh, I'm blanking on the name of that type of memory.
Prospective memory.
Thank you. Prospective memory, which sounds like perspective, PER, but it's actually PRO. So prospective memory, which is basically that idea of like remembering to remember to take that action later. So when you're like, hey, I should pick up milk on the way home, and then like half an hour later you leave work, that idea is completely gone. You completely forgot that you intended to like take this action later. So for me, like when my wife was saying like, hey, can you take out the trash? I was saying yes. And I was being truthful, like, yeah, no problem. That's
Yeah.
really easy. I'll get off the couch and then I'll take out the trash and then I'll go up to bed. But what actually happened is because of that, like prospective memory difficulty or deficiency, however you want to label that, I would get up, no idea about that. And then I'd go straight to bed without taking out the trash. Because I wasn't realizing that that happened, this happened for like months and months and months where my wife kept telling me, hey, can you take out the trash? And I would say, sure, no problem. And then she's like starting to think like, man, what a jerk I married. He like keeps saying he's going to take the trash and he never ever
And he
does.
purposely walks past the trash every
Exactly.
night.
Yeah. So it was this big stress happening in our marriage that I wasn't even really aware of at the
Yeah.
time, because for me, it was like all that just wasn't even happening. Or I would like very, very occasionally get up and remember to take out the trash. And then in my
Mhm.
like very optimistic memory, it would fill in the gaps of like, oh, I pretty much do it like almost every night. It's like what I
Yeah.
thought or
Yeah.
something like that, which is like, no, you did it
Yeah.
once in like 3 months.
But you have taken out the trash. So I'm curious, what did you do? Because
Yeah.
I know
So this
everyone's going to
was
be like, did you take out the trash? Is this okay now?
Yeah. So luckily, like thankfully for my marriage, like we did find out that this was an issue, and we talked about it
Mhm.
with that kind of therapist that I was meeting. And she suggested like a very, very simple strategy. And it was basically, we would do the same thing. So my wife would say, hey, can you take out the trash? And I would say yes. And then she would we had like a whiteboard that we hung up in a prominent location that I would have to
Mhm.
walk by to go upstairs.
Mhm.
And then she would write just like a little empty checkbox and then say, took out trash, and write that on the whiteboard, which I know sounds silly, and then
No.
I would get up off the couch and I would see that and be like, oh yeah, that's the thing that I said I was going to do. Then I would take out the trash and like very happily go over there and check off the little box and then go up to bed. And we did that basically every single night. She would say it, she would write it brand new on the board, and then I would take out the trash and check it off. And I basically like never forgot again. Like that worked. It was a really powerful moment, I think, for our marriage, because it was like, it showed how real this thing was that was happening. And it showed that it's like, it's not me trying to be lazy, trying to get out of doing this little like 30-second chore. It's like, it really is a memory issue that's happening here.
Mhm.
And so through that, it was like really healthy for us kind of figuring out like the reality of what was causing kind of this ongoing struggle for us, and that it wasn't
Yeah.
about bad intentions and stuff like that. And it took a long time. Like, I don't remember exactly, but it was probably months of doing this every single night. And eventually we finally hit a point where we didn't have to do it anymore. It was just like at some point it kind of locked in for
Mhm.
becoming part of my night routine. So she doesn't say well, for the most part, she doesn't really say it anymore. And we don't write it on the whiteboard anymore. I just usually do it. Like I get up and it's part of my going to bed routine. And so
That's
that like
awesome.
locked in,
That's
but it took a
really
long time.
cool. Yeah. Well, it sounds like what you actually did was you transferred it into your long-term memory, which with ADHD, according to the research, we're actually quite fine with that. It's that
Yeah.
short-term memory that we struggle with. So that transition, having something for that transition is such a good idea, and so helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. That it's that short-term memory that's really tricky. I like to
Mhm.
think of it as like, I call it like a memory shelf, where it's like basically when you have ADHD, your working memory, you have a much smaller shelf. So you can put a lot less items
Yeah.
on that
Yeah.
shelf
Things
to be
keep
able to kind of
falling
like,
off the shelf.
yeah. Or like if you're like in the middle of working and then someone comes up and talks to you, it's basically like they just came over and knocked everything off your memory
Yeah.
shelf. It's like, oh, now I don't even
So
know what I was
rude.
working on anymore. So rude. But yeah, like because of that, I feel like sometimes I'll be having conversations with people and I'm really struggling because in my head I'm like, I can only put like 3 or 4 things on the shelf, and you're giving me lots of details, and I'm like juggling, like trying to figure out which things are important to this conversation. If this conversation goes on too long, I'm not going to remember any of this. Which,
Yeah.
like, speaking back to like the work environment, that was something that I was able to talk with my manager about, of like,
Mhm.
hey, we had a great conversation and I felt like we left the conversation and I thought I knew what we had to do, but I would ask them to
Mhm.
clarify, like, what is your expectation? Like, what
Yeah.
are those bullet points of things that you want to see from me? Because I might have forgotten them when I was trying to figure out which things are going to fit on that little memory
Yeah.
shelf. So, yeah.
That's awesome. That's really great. Sarah, did you have any other questions from the audience or for yourself about memory?
I really loved what you said about the shelf. We usually call it a bucket, memory bucket, and it's got holes in it.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
But I like shelf because I feel like
Yeah, I
that's the
love that.
feeling when people knock things off, when you get
I got the
interrupted when
cat
you're in the middle of
vibe.
working. Yeah. You're like,
Yeah,
what are you
yeah, the
doing? And
cat.
everyone's like, I'm just asking.
Totally.
So I'm just going to start asking you the questions that we ask everyone here at the ADHD Skills Lab. So my question to you is, what is one professional achievement that you're the most proud of?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be the book. It was such a huge project and there was a lot to it, especially kind of in that end. Like once I was like, the manuscript's almost done. And then it was like, because I kind of took a lot on myself of like, I really cared about the design and layout of it because I wanted it to feel really ADHD friendly. And so I
Mm,
tackled that. And I have design background, not specifically in books, but I took all that on. And then like the same with all the marketing, figuring out like how to promote it and figuring out how to get the ebook version of it and managing like
mm.
KDP and which is Amazon's Kindle direct printing and all of the different, it was just like all this stuff that I had to do and had to figure out,
Yeah.
which on one hand is fun. Like I enjoy kind of figuring out new things. Like I think one of the things that I really love about most people with ADHD is a lot of us are those like lifelong learners and we like figuring
Hmm.
out these new things. And that's something I've always been passionate about. So it was fun in that respect, but it was just like so much. And so that's probably the thing I'm most proud of.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, because like I know a lot of people are, but I wasn't somebody that was like, oh, one day I'm going to write a book. Like it didn't, I was like,
Hmm.
no, it wasn't even like really a thing that I had considered. And then it just sort of like happened in like
Yeah.
the idea for it just sort of happened in these last couple of years, where it's like I
Yeah.
really wish as I was learning all these things about ADHD, I was like, I really wish there was just like a guide that my doctor could have handed to me at the beginning that told me all
Yeah.
this stuff rather than
It's
me
going to
like,
be okay. Here's the book.
right. Rather than me like finding out I have ADHD and then like 3 or 4 years later stumbling on
Hmm.
like rejection sensitivity. Like, no one told me about this.
Yeah.
This is a
Yeah.
pretty huge, like all of this emotional dysregulation. Like, I heard nothing about that from the doctor or anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is a pretty huge part of having ADHD and no one even told me about it. And so like I'm
100%.
pretty proud of it because of that, because I finished it and did all this stuff, and also hearing like the impact it's had for people. Like you had
Hmm.
mentioned, like you read it in a couple of days, and I don't know what it takes to
Hmm.
read a normal book, but a lot of people have told me that they read it they hyper focused and read it like in one sitting or
Yeah.
that sort of thing. They got through it really quickly, which was very, very much my goal. It was like, I want this to be something that someone with ADHD that maybe doesn't even read a lot of books will just like sit down and just like fly through this thing, because it's short paragraphs,
Yeah.
short chapters, illustrations, like
Mm-hmm.
pulling you through. So it's really
Mm-hmm.
easy to kind of get through it. So yeah, very proud of how just sort of how everything has gone with the Extra Focus book.
Yeah. Awesome. And that's so wonderful. And yeah, to your point, I mean, not only do I have ADHD, but I'm actually actively engaging in like keeping a toddler away from the book because he thinks all
Right.
physical books are his to be read to. So we had to sort of read it together to get through the book. So yeah, it was like the most difficult, circumstances of reading. And it was very easy. It was great.
Awesome.
What about a professional failure that embarrasses you? And how did you deal with any embarrassment? Because we all have these stories.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, I've got a few to pick from. I'll say one was probably I'd been working at a job and I had been there at the time. I think it was probably my longest job. I'd been there 3 years, which was like unheard of because most jobs I was
Mhm.
at for like 2 months
Mhm.
at that time. And I had thought everything was going well. And so I'd been doing my part. I did have a role that did like a million different things. And so there's a lot going on, but I felt like I was doing great, hearing no complaints, no issues anywhere. And then I got that dreaded, "Hey, we need to talk" from my
Oh.
manager. And I was like, oh no,
Oh.
this has never turned out good in my entire life. So in that meeting with my manager, he had basically for the last almost a year had been writing down every little thing that I had gotten
Oh my
wrong and not
gosh.
telling me about it. So it's just like all
Oh.
this stuff had like built up. And yeah, it was just like destroyed me because like I've said before, like I'm trying to be like the good employee. I'm trying to do all the right things. And I had no idea that these little issues were like building up. And so it's just like this giant list of like, hey, here's everything you've messed up for the last year. And it was super
Oh my
embarrassing.
gosh.
And it like destroyed. And we had like up to that point, I thought we had like a really good like working relationship. I thought everything was awesome. I thought I was going to be there for a really long time. And that happened. And then it was basically just like, I didn't quit immediately, but it was basically, I was like, well,
You
this
were
is
like,
this
that's
is
it.
ruined now. It's over. Because now I live in fear of that happening again, of like, oh, he's writing down every little thing. And I don't know what's the thing I could be forgetting that is going to be on that evil list now that's going to just like ruin everything. And so that was super embarrassing. And it was at the time, it was just like everyone knew that I worked at this place. And like, I was connected with all the people there. And then I ended up leaving just kind of like a few months later, not in a huff, but still sort of like it was pretty quickly. Like we had that meeting, and then it was like it's over, and it was really hard because then people were asking why'd you leave? I thought everything was great here, and then I had to like say like, well, things apparently weren't as great. So it was tough, and I have, like I said, I had a million stories like this. There's another job, just really quickly. It was a design job. I'd been there a month and I was struggling because like the environment was just not, we were all working in like one office together, and I didn't know I had ADHD, but it was like I was distracted all the time and it was like really hard to focus. And I was like dropping the ball on like these little details that I knew. I was very aware that the issues were there, and I was like trying to figure out how to do it. And then I had another one of those like, hey, we need to talk. But it was like we had one of those meetings in his office. So like the owner of the company, it was a really tiny company. The owner of the company in his office connected to the room where everyone's working with the door open, and he just like tears me apart. He's just
Oh my gosh.
like, you're messing everything up. You're like terrible fit here, all these things. I was like, couldn't we at least shut the door so at least I can like be embarrassed by myself in here? Anyway, that was one of the worst experiences of my life. And that was a job where, I'd only been there a month, and it was like, I thought it was going to be like this really good fit. And it was just like, nope, this is just another one of those failures where I have to try and like figure out how to find that next job right away and navigate the whole situation. And then obviously for that job, I was pretty newly married. So then having to go talk to my wife, like I just got fired from the job I've been at for a month. Like is pretty darn embarrassing. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, definitely. And I really appreciate you sharing those stories, by the way, because, we always ask about that stuff because everybody has one of those stories at least. And most people say, I have 100. Which one would you like?
Right. Yeah. I think
it's
that's
good to share,
Totally. I think so much of the things that I've struggled with ADHD for most of my life were really hard because I felt alone. I felt like I'm the only one going through all of this horrible stuff, and I don't know how to navigate it. And I can't, like, no one can relate. Like, it feels like it's just me. I think that's been one of the like amazing things just over the, past few years, is sort of connecting with other ADHDers online, and sort of that whole space happening with social media, for all the like ills that happen with social media, of which there are plenty, but like connecting with other people with ADHD has been something amazing. Just like being able to relate with people that have gone through these same struggles and can sort of understand like what it's like to not know why these things are happening, or having the issues. There's often that struggle where it's like, this happened again. That's, I think, one of the most frustrating things, when that thing comes up again. And I'm like, oh, I thought maybe that last one was the last time, but here it is again. And just like knowing that that's like a struggle for so many other people, it really helps me feel more understood, and not just like this weirdo that's broken, or this weird shame that's just like piled on. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not. And I totally agree with that. Well, thank you so much, Jesse, for coming on the podcast. Thank you for trying the live episode podcast. It's only the second time we've done this. And, if anybody wants to find out about you, they want to find your book, where can they find it?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been awesome. The book is just called Extra Focus, and you can find it everywhere, Amazon, any other bookstore. But if you go to extrafocusbook.com, that has sort of like all the direct links for all the places that it's available. And then also I have my newsletter at extrafocus.com, which is my weekly newsletter about ADHD.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, guys. Thank you so much to everybody in the audience. We're going to pop off now. But wonderful to have you all here. And we'll see you again. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.